welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you've ever looked at complex strategic challenges, whether military, corporate, geopolitical, and wondered where the actual thinking starts. Well, it's not just about drawing arrows on a map.
Yeah, definitely not.
It's about the intellectual crucible, right? The cognitive heavy lifting that has to happen before anyone writes the first mission order.
Precisely. We often associate planning with these, rigid steps, but today we're really diving into the art of strategy creation itself.
Okay.
It's the difference between just having a simple blueprint and, deeply understanding the structure you're actually trying to build. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's insight, it rings truer than ever. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything.
Right.
When you're dealing with a crisis, the specific plan you design, well, it's likely going to fail in some way, but the understanding, that shared mental model you developed through the planning process, that's what lets you adapt and hopefully succeed.
That makes sense. So to guide us through this really intricate subject, this foundational thought process behind modern advanced military planning, we've compiled quite an excellent stack of sources here.
We have.
Our analysis, it draws directly from foundational doctrine like Joint Publication 5.0, the specific guidance found in the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook, and also the broader strategic context you get from the U.S. Army War College Guide to National Security Issues, Volume 2, National Security Policy and Strategy.
And we're also pulling some deep insights from a really fascinating book, Creativity in Military Complexity, Design, Disruptors, and Defense Forces. It gives us a critical lens on why maybe the traditional approach isn't always cutting it anymore.
Okay.
So our mission for you today, the listener, is to explore these cognitive methodologies, operational art and operational design that really underpin the initial stages of the joint planning process. We're going to focus intensely on those critical first 3 steps of operational design. That's where the problem gets framed, the environment is understood, and the approach starts to get visualized.
Okay, so let's start with the fundamental reason why this intellectual heavy lifting, this, shift in thinking, is so necessary. The sources we looked at consistently argue that the environment, the whole context where operations happen, it's fundamentally changed.
Right.
It's not just dangerous anymore. It's characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and novelty too.
That combination, people often sum it up as VUCAN. It really requires planners to, maybe toss out decades of traditional linear thinking. It's one challenge if you're dealing with a system that just has many moving parts.
Sure.
But if you're dealing with a system where the moving parts actually learn and adapt as you try to interact with them, that's a wholly different and much more profound challenge.
Okay, so we need to clarify that crucial distinction then.
Yeah.
Complicated versus complex adaptive systems. It sounds a bit academic, maybe, but the choice between those two seems to fundamentally dictate the planning methodology you choose.
Oh, it absolutely does. As the research in creativity and military complexity really stresses, if you're tackling a complicated system, you're dealing with multiple independent components, yes, but they work in a predictable sort of linear way.
Like a machine.
Exactly. Think of engineering a deep-sea submersible or fixing a high-performance jet engine. It takes immense skill, vast knowledge, lots of time. But ultimately, if you follow the checklist, you will solve the problem. It's knowable.
Right, a complicated system has a solution, even if it's really difficult to find.
Exactly. But a complex adaptive system, now that's different. That's a dynamic network of interconnected elements, people, governments, social movements, technologies, that constantly evolves and adapts. It does this in response to changes in interactions within its environment.
So it's not static.
Not at all. It's nonlinear, unpredictable. Trying to force a solution onto a complex system is like trying to command an entire ecological web. Every action you take creates these unforeseen ripple effects and feedback loops because the system itself is learning and responding to you. Warfare, stability operations, great power competition. They exist squarely in this realm of chaos and unpredictability.
So the aha moment here is that those traditional sort of functionalist, reductionist approaches, the ones that work beautifully for complicated problems, they're just inadequate for complex adaptive systems because the system learns and changes as you act.
That's it.
The sources actually state the need for unconventional, innovative responses is, quote, omnipresent.
That's the central challenge, really. Since conventional deductive planning, which relies on applying known rules to known situations, it just doesn't work reliably anymore. So commanders need a different intellectual tool set. And this is where operational art and operational design really come into play.
Okay, let's unpack those terms then, because I feel like they're often used interchangeably. But our sources seem to clearly delineate them.
They do, and it's an important distinction. Operational art is the overarching cognitive approach. You could almost call it the philosophy used by commanders and their staffs. It relies heavily on their inherent skill, their knowledge, experience, creativity, judgment, all those things.
Okay.
As detailed in Joint Publication 5.0, the fundamental purpose is to develop campaigns and operations that successfully link the tactical employment of forces directly to those high-level strategic objectives. It's about the holistic management of, protracted armed conflicts that might consist of multiple linked campaigns.
So operational art is kind of the philosophy of linking means to ends, strategy down to tactics. How then does operational design fit within that philosophy? What does it do?
Right, so operational design is the focused methodology, the technique, if you will, used within that broader approach of operational art. It's the specific cognitive effort that's intended to disrupt those orthodox paradigms, those standard ways of thinking that usually limit creative thought when you face a novel or unprecedented situation.
Well, it's about breaking the mold.
Exactly. It emphasizes iterative processes, continuous experimentation, critical reflection, and, maybe most importantly, reframing the problem again and again. When you're confronted with a truly unique challenge, you often have to rely on abductive reasoning.
Abductive reasoning.
Yeah, it's that process of forming the most likely hypothesis from the observations you have. It's different from deduction, which applies general rules, or induction, which forms general rules from specifics. Abduction is about the best guess based on what you see, and it's critical for fostering truly innovative solutions rather than just applying deductive logic based on, say, outdated doctrine.
Okay, that makes sense. This shift in cognitive approach then leads directly to the start of the formal process. Joint planning process, step 1, planning initiation.
Yeah.
Why is the joint planning process unique in starting with initiation, rather than just, say, receiving a clear mission order from above?
Yeah, the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook makes a really important distinction here. Other planning methodologies might start with a clear directive. Go seize Objective X. Simple enough.
Right.
But joint commanders, especially at higher levels, often face what are called wicked problems. These have to be intellectually sorted out before a clear, executable mission can even be formulated. Sometimes the guidance from higher authorities is vague, or maybe even conflicting.
So it's a situation that requires a commander to figure out what the mission should be, not just how to execute one they were handed down.
Precisely. This demands a mindset of adaptive learning, first to visualize and then achieve a shared understanding of the problem across the entire team. This is why the commander's role in this initial phase is absolutely essential. They have to apply their experience, their intuition, their judgment, to assess the whole situation and develop that shared understanding across the joint force.
And that shared understanding forged through this operational design thinking.
That then allows the commander to provide focused guidance that streamlines the rest of the planning process. It prevents the staff from wasting huge amounts of time chasing down approaches that might only address symptoms, not the root causes.
Okay, so after the commander initiates the process, operational design step 1 kicks in, and it's all about understanding the environment. It seems like this step isn't just about looking at maps and terrain. It's really about anchoring the entire effort in high-level policy and global strategy.
It absolutely has to be. The Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook is really adamant about this. Strategic context is the first principle of operational design.
First principle. Yes. This echoes Clausewitz's mandate, really realized in modern doctrine. You simply cannot propose a major military action without fully understanding its political roots and its ultimate political aims. War is, at the end of the day, an instrument of policy.
And where does that policy framework actually begin for the planners? Where do they start looking?
It begins with a really comprehensive analysis of strategic guidance. The staff has to absorb and internalize the highest level documents: the national security strategy, the national defense strategy, the national military strategy, and any specific planning directives that might come from the National Command Authority. This guidance provides the essential purpose and focus. It effectively defines what winning actually means in a broader national security context.
The U.S. Army War College Guide gives us a pretty good structure for understanding those fundamental national interests that drive this high-level policy. What are those modern core interests that the military approach ultimately has to serve? Yeah, the guide organizes these interests into three critical pillars. First is enhancing security. This covers protecting the homeland, obviously, but also allies, and global commons like sea lanes, trade routes, space.
Okay.
Second is promoting prosperity. This goes way beyond just basic economic stability at home. It includes safeguarding international trade, securing critical resources, maintaining the global economic system that, sustains us.
Right.
And the third pillar is promoting democracy and human rights. This involves promoting democratic values, supporting international law, advocating for human dignity abroad. So every military operation must, at its core, link back somehow to protecting or advancing one or more of these three pillars.
Okay, that sets the policy parameters. Now, how does the staff systematically make that transition from this high-level policy down to the complex operational environment itself? This seems to be where that holistic systems perspective becomes really crucial.
Right. To make that transition, planners use the political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure analytical framework, usually called PMESII for short, that will stick to the full name. It's detailed extensively in Joint Publication 5.0 and the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook.
Okay.
Now, the mistake many planners can make is treating this just like a simple checklist. Check the box for political, check the box for military, move on.
But the real value isn't in the list itself, it's in the connections.
Absolutely.
Okay.
The critical element is stressing the interrelationships and dependencies among all those categories. For instance, if you analyze the adversary's economic environment and you find a dependency on, say, a single energy export, well, a political decision to sanction that export immediately ripples through their social environment, maybe causing unrest. It impacts the information environment through propaganda efforts. Maybe their military financing gets hit. You're not just studying 6 separate things. You're studying the network of, maybe 12 to 15 key relationships that bind those 6 things together. This analysis is what provides that required systems perspective.
So that's how you build that complex mental model of the environment.
Right.
And Joint Publication 5.0 stresses that this environment includes much more than just the physical battlefield. Is that right?
That's correct. The operational environment is vast. It encompasses all the physical domains: air, land, maritime, space, and critically, the information environment, which includes cyberspace. But furthermore, the analysis absolutely must integrate the civilian environment. We're talking about population demographics, critical infrastructure dependencies like power grids and water systems, essential services, and those deep sociocultural factors: language, religion, history, tribal structures, local politics. Ignoring these elements, whether they belong to friendly, adversary, or even neutral actors, it just means you're operating in a vacuum. And that pretty much guarantees unintended and potentially disastrous effects down the line.
Okay, so once we've mapped out this complex system of the operational environment using things like the political, military, economic, social, information, and infrastructure framework, operational design step 2 then focuses on defining the problem. This feels like maybe the single most consequential step in the entire process. If you define the problem incorrectly, everything that follows, the objectives, the operations, the resources, it's all going to be flawed, right?
Yeah. That is the core warning, yes, from the Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook. The problem frame is the course setter for everything else. If the primary problem is misidentified, you might launch a brilliant campaign that only ends up treating a symptom, or worse, it creates entirely new and unwanted conditions.
Can you use an example, maybe?
Sure. Consider a situation where planners identify, say, a local militia as the problem. But the true underlying problem might be deep political corruption that actually allows that militia to thrive and recruit.
Oh, okay.
So eliminating the militia, while seemingly successful tactically, might only make room for a new one to pop up because the root cause, the corruption, wasn't addressed. You solved the symptom, not the disease.
This brings us back to that concept you mentioned earlier, Riddle and Weber's idea of the wicked problem. Why is military planning in these complex environments constantly dealing with challenges that are described as wicked? What makes them wicked?
Well, wicked problems have a few key characteristics. They're often unique. There's no perfect historical analog or template to follow. They tend to defy simple definitions because different stakeholders will define the problem differently based on their own perspectives and interests.
Right.
And maybe most disturbingly, attempting to solve a wicked problem may, in fact, create several additional unforeseen dilemmas. It's like poking a complex system. You don't always know what will happen next. Since warfare is fundamentally unpredictable anyway, we have to embrace things like self-reflection, recursion. That means going back and re-examining initial assumptions and continuous reframing throughout the process.
So you're constantly checking if you got the problem right.
You have to. It's a humbling exercise for any planner who, prefers neat, linear answers. Wicked problems don't offer those.
Okay, so how does the staff actually formalize this problem definition then? It can't just be a philosophical chat in a room. What are the the specific sub-steps that take this abstract analysis and turn it into something more concrete and actionable framework.
Right, it needs structure.
Yeah.
The first sub-step is developing problem sets and prioritizing the key problems that emerge from the environmental analysis. You might identify 5, 10 major challenges, but which one or which combination is the absolute root cause or the most critical to address first?
Okay, prioritize. What's next?
The second is developing a theory of the problem. This goes beyond just a bulleted list. It involves crafting both a compelling narrative, a story that explains the problem, and usually a graphic visualization. These help contextualize the critical focal points and explain the system's friction and dynamics.
A narrative to tell the story of the problem and a graphic to show the relationships.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Exactly. The third sub-step is describing the limitations. This means clearly listing all the explicit constraints, things you must do, and restraints, things you cannot do, that are imposed by that strategic guidance we talked about earlier, or by international law, rules of engagement, things like that.
Got it. Limits.
And finally, you get to the core, developing the concise problem statement itself. This ultimate statement has to clearly articulate the specific areas or conditions that, when successfully acted upon, will transform the current unacceptable situation into the desired end state you're aiming for.
I found this concept of tension analysis in Joint Publication 5.0 really interesting. How does that technique help the commander find the root of the problem, or maybe where to intervene?
Tension analysis is a really insightful way for commanders to identify resistance or friction, or maybe just the forces working against their objectives within that operational environment.
How does it work?
By deeply analyzing the natural tendencies and the potentials of the various actors involved, what are they capable of doing, and what are their inherent goals or motivations? You start to pinpoint the fault lines, the areas of instability or conflict. There's always tension between the existing condition and the desired condition. This friction, this tension, points you towards where concentrated action or intervention, or perhaps just shaping activities, will be most effective and potentially least costly. It's often about leveraging inherent instabilities in the system, rather than just launching a head-on assault against an adversary's entrenched strength.
And often when we talk about that entrenched strength, we're talking about the center of gravity. How critical is understanding the center of gravity concept to this whole problem framing stage?
Oh, it's absolutely central. Historically, the enemy center of gravity is often considered the primary problem, or at least intimately linked to it, because you simply cannot attain your strategic objective without removing that center of gravity as the chief source of power or will or cohesion that opposes you.
So identifying it can't wait until later planning steps.
No, exactly. It has to be tentatively identified, analyzed, and refined right here during this problem framing stage. It might start during the intelligence preparation of the operational environment, but it really needs to become fully articulated now as part of defining the core problem.
But the key isn't just identifying the center of gravity itself, right? It's about finding the vulnerable elements that support it.
Absolutely. We have to analyze the center of gravity's critical capabilities. What does it do that makes it powerful? Then its critical requirements. What does it need to function? And finally, its critical vulnerabilities. Where is it susceptible to being neutralized or defeated?
And the sources stress this isn't a one-time thing.
Not at all. The analysis is not static. Planners have to continually analyze and refine their understanding of the center of gravity based on friendly actions and, crucially, the adversary's reactions and adaptations. The enemy gets a vote, always.
So what are the criteria then? How do planners decide if a particular vulnerability is actually worth targeting? Just because it's vulnerable doesn't mean you should attack it, right?
That's a critical point. The planner has to carefully compare the criticality of the threat's vulnerabilities against several factors before deciding to commit resources to attacking them. The key factors are usually summarized as accessibility, redundancy, resiliency, and impact, sometimes called ARI.
Okay, ARIR. Can you break that down?
Sure. Accessibility. Can we actually reach or affect this vulnerability with the means we have? Redundancy. Does the enemy have backup systems or alternative ways to perform this function if we hit it? Resiliency. How quickly can the enemy repair or reconstitute this capability if we damage it? And impact. If we successfully attack this vulnerability, what is the actual effect on the center of gravity and the enemy's overall capability or will? Will it be decisive or just a noise?
So a vulnerability might be critical, but if it's, say, highly redundant, or super resilient.
Then attacking it might be a waste of valuable resources, or worse, it could just increase the enemy's resistance without achieving a significant effect. A hasty or flawed analysis right here on center of gravity vulnerabilities is often cited as one of the single biggest contributors to plans failing to achieve their strategic objectives at an acceptable cost.
Okay, so we've wrestled with the wicked problem, we've defined it, we've analyzed the environment and the likely center of gravity. Now, operational design step 3 shifts the focus entirely to visualizing the solution, what the sources call the operational approach. Let's start with the end goal. What are the ideal conditions we're actually trying to create?
Right. The desired environment, the win condition, if you like, is formally codified by the military end state. This isn't just victory, it's a precise definition of the conditions on the ground, and maybe in the information space too, beyond which the president no longer requires the military instrument of national power as the primary dominating means to achieve the remaining national objectives.
So the military might still be involved, but maybe not leading the effort anymore.
Exactly. Other instruments of power, diplomatic, informational, economic, they need to be ready and able to take the lead in consolidating gains, ensuring stability, moving forward. The military sets the conditions for that transition.
And leading us toward that military end state are the objectives. How are those defined?
Objectives need to be clearly defined. They must be decisive, meaning they contribute directly to the end state, and they must be attainable with the resources available. Each objective should establish a single, clear result and link directly back to achieving that overall end state. Objectives are what the joint force must accomplish.
Okay. And below objectives, you have effects.
Correct. Once the objectives are set, you then define the effects. These are the specific conditions you need to create in the operational environment that will enable the objective's achievement. For example, if the objective is, say, defeat the adversary's primary conventional ground forces in Sector X, a supporting effect might be disrupt all adversary long-range logistics corridors supporting Sector X. Creating that effect helps you achieve the objective.
Okay, that clarifies the hierarchy. Now we get to the real core of this visualization step. The operational approach itself. This sounds like the big idea, the strategy in broad strokes.
It is. The operational approach is the broad concept that provides the commander's visualization and the general gist of what is to be done. In its initial form, it can actually be quite simple, sometimes even employing a metaphor or an analogy to describe the overall strategy.
Like the Anaconda Plan example.
Exactly. The Joint Planning Process Step 1 Handbook references the Anaconda Plan from the American Civil War. It was a clear, simplified graphic portrayal, a snake squeezing the Confederacy representing a naval blockade and territorial seizure aimed at suffocating the opponent. That's an operational approach.
So it starts simple, maybe conceptual.
It often does. Then, as the staff refines this visualization, it gets more detailed. It starts to include a combination of general actions, maybe some key intermediate objectives or decisive points along the way, the necessary effects we just talked about, milestones to track progress, and potential lines of operations or lines of effort to organize the activities.
This visualization process must also manage how things unfold in time and space. How do planners think about arranging operations? I saw terms like simultaneity versus sequential operations.
Right. Planners have to be masters of integrating actions across time, space, and purpose. Simultaneity refers to the concurrent, integrated application of military and sometimes non-military power against an enemy's key capabilities and sources of strength. This also happens across tactical, operational, and strategic levels, all at the same time.
What's the goal of doing everything at once like that?
The goal is usually to overload the adversary's decision-making apparatus, their command and control system. You want to hit them in so many ways so quickly that they simply can't cope, forcing confusion, paralysis, and maybe even a rapid collapse.
Operation Iraqi Freedom, the initial phase, is often cited as a textbook example of trying for simultaneity, isn't it?
It is, yes. The initial phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom aimed for that shock and awe effect. You had air, maritime, land, special operations forces attacking across all domains and multiple levels of war simultaneously. The objective wasn't just to destroy individual targets, but fundamentally to paralyze the Iraqi regime's ability to coordinate any kind of coherent defense. It leveraged their inability to respond effectively to integrated multi-domain attacks.
Okay. In contrast, then, sequential operations are used when maybe you don't have the resources or perhaps the political conditions don't allow for that massive, immediate, all-at-once effect.
Exactly right. Sequential operations ensure that actions are carefully ordered in time and space to maximize their effects. The idea is often to create favorable conditions first before commencing subsequent, maybe larger or riskier operations. The key here is setting the conditions properly.
Is there a good example of that?
Operation Enduring Freedom 1 in Afghanistan, right after 9/11, is often seen as a classic example. Instead of a massive immediate ground invasion, which wasn't really feasible or perhaps politically desirable at that moment, the operation began sequentially. It started primarily with special operations forces and air power linking up with and assisting indigenous Afghan opposition forces. That set the stage for the later, more limited introduction of conventional ground forces needed for consolidation and stability operations. One step enabled the next.
Makes sense. Beyond just arranging simultaneous or sequential actions, timing and tempo are also mentioned as crucial elements of visualization.
Absolutely critical. Timing is the art, really, of choosing the optimal moment for employing forces or capabilities to maximize friendly advantage and exploit enemy vulnerabilities. Tempo, on the other hand, is the rhythm, the pace of operations.
And high tempo is generally good.
Generally, yes. A fundamental truth in conflict is that forcing a high operational tempo on the enemy usually causes frustration, confusion, and disruption. It prevents them from resting, refitting, rethinking. Ultimately, it can shatter their ability to adapt effectively to your actions. You want to operate inside their decision cycle.
How do planners manage all these time factors? It seems complex.
They use several tools. The Time-Phased Force and Deployment Data, or TPFDD, is a detailed list of what forces arrive where and when. They use phasing to break the operation into logical stages, each with its own objectives and conditions. They develop branches, which are contingency plans for unexpected events, both positive opportunities and negative setbacks. And they plan for sequels, which are the subsequent operations or campaigns that logically follow once the current operation achieves its end state. All of these help manage the temporal factors and ensure the right forces and capabilities are available at the right time and place. Pauses between phases, by the way, can be necessary but are inherently risky as they give the enemy time to recover.
Okay, that covers the time and space arrangement. Finally, within this operational approach, we need to understand the ultimate goal, the mechanisms used to achieve the effects. What are the main categories of force employment mechanisms that underpin the visualized approach?
Right. Joint Publication 5.0 recognizes three broad types of employment mechanisms. These are always integrated, you rarely use just one, and they're typically aimed primarily at the adversary's center of gravity or its critical vulnerabilities. The first category covers the more traditional combat actions, the defeat mechanisms.
What are those?
These include verbs like isolate, disrupt, degrade, and neutralize. There are subtle but important differences. For instance, neutralize aims to render an enemy system completely ineffective for a period, perhaps without destroying it permanently, whereas disrupt might mean just interrupting enemy operations or systems temporarily without necessarily degrading their long-term capability significantly. That distinction could be crucial when, say, policy restraints limit the use of lethal or destructive force.
Okay, defeat mechanisms. What's the second category? It seems to address the political reality of many modern conflicts.
Exactly. That's the stabilization mechanisms. These include actions like enforce, control, influence, and support. These mechanisms are inherently more political and often focused on post-conflict or stability phases. They're aimed at creating conditions where legitimate local authorities and essential services can be established or reestablished, restoring civil order, managing conflict peaceably, and gaining the support of the population.
And the third category mentioned was competition. This one seemed a bit vague in some earlier doctrine, but how is it framed now in this context?
Yes, competition has become much more central. In this operational design context, competition covers the broad spectrum of integrated military activities that occur deliberately short of armed conflict or outside of large-scale stabilization operations.
So like day-to-day military activities.
Pretty much. It involves things like shaping the security environment through exercises and presence, deterring aggression through demonstrated capability and resolve, maintaining access to key regions, building partner capacity, intelligence gathering. All those activities that influence the geopolitical balance or prepare the theater for potential future operations if needed. It's that constant, often subtle, engagement aimed at gaining advantage in what people sometimes call the gray zone. The goal is often to ensure potential adversaries understand that the cost of escalation would be too high, ideally without ever needing to fire a shot in anger.
Okay, we've clearly established that operational design demands a high degree of creativity, intellectual rigor, systems thinking, all needed to navigate this complexity. But the source, creativity, and military complexity highlights a pretty stark reality. The organization's own culture can often fight against this kind of innovation. What are some of the most maybe insidious organizational and cultural constraints that act like antibodies against design thinking?
Yeah, this section of the source material is deeply revealing and probably resonates with people in many large organizations, not just the military. One of the most powerful blockers identified is the fear of failure.
That sounds familiar.
Right. In many structured, hierarchical organizations, taking risks and experimenting, even if intellectually sound, can be discouraged because failure, or even perceived failure, is often linked directly to skewed promotion systems or career paths. If you try something innovative and it doesn't quite pan out, even while learning valuable lessons, it might be seen as a black mark, potentially hindering your career trajectory.
And that leads to that phenomenon described as the frozen middle, right?
Exactly. You can get these iron kernels or mid-career leaders who become motivated less by the organization's long-term strategic needs and adaptability and more by protecting their own personal record. This naturally leads to intellectual conformity and risk aversion.
What else gets in the way?
Well, related to this are rigid structures themselves, which can stifle the autonomy and empowerment that are really necessary for creative thought to flourish. And then there's bureaucratic reductionism.
Bureaucratic reductionism.
Yeah, it's that reflexive adherence to rules, regulations, standard operating procedures. Now, rules are important. They manage cognitive load, ensure safety, and interoperability. But they fail spectacularly when the situation demands personnel understand when it's appropriate, even necessary, to intellectually deviate from established rules in order to adapt to a truly dynamic and unforeseen situation. The bureaucracy can become an end in itself.
And the sources also reference the Peter Principle, which seems to add another layer to this problem of effective leadership for innovation.
Right. The Peter Principle, the idea that individuals tend to get promoted based on success in their previous role until they eventually reach a level where they are actually incompetent for the demands of the new role.
How does that apply here?
Well, in the context of innovation and design, this means personnel might be promoted based on, say, excellent execution of complicated, predictable tasks. Maybe they were a great logistician or a training manager, but they might lack the cognitive skills, the temperament, or maybe even the deep expertise necessary to effectively lead innovation efforts in truly complex, adaptive environments. The result can be a stagnation of ideas at the very leadership levels that should be driving change and adaptation.
You also mentioned earlier the dangers of maybe rushing the process by jumping too quickly to linear tools. Can you remind us of those acronyms the sources mention?
Yes, the sources specifically warn against the rushed or inappropriate application of rigid, linear problem-solving tools like integrated management of actions and planning, sometimes called IMAP, or comprehensive management of actions and planning, CMAP. Now, these tools can be valuable for managing complicated tasks, for tracking execution once a plan is set, but they often prioritize quick fixes, checklist completion, and process adherence over the deep, holistic, recursive analysis that's truly required for genuinely complex systems. What happens is commanders and staffs, often under intense time pressure, might be tempted to skip the hard, messy upfront design work and jump straight into these more executable but potentially shallow planning frameworks. They mistake activity for progress.
Okay, so if the organization itself can be structurally biased towards conformity, towards reductionist thinking, towards fear of failure, how do we actively nurture the creative mindsets, the design thinking that we've established are so critical? What solutions does the research suggest?
It's a huge challenge, but not insurmountable. We have to intentionally foster an innovative culture. A key starting point is encouraging divergent thinking.
Divergent thinking.
Yeah, it's the unrestrained, imaginative generation of lots of different ideas, even wild ones. It's the opposite of convergent thinking, which tries to quickly narrow down options to find a single best answer. Divergent thinking is absolutely essential for expanding established mental models, for challenging assumptions, and for generating those unconventional strategies that might be necessary for achieving an asymmetric advantage against an adaptive adversary.
And this probably requires looking beyond the usual suspects, the people who always speak up, for those innovative contributions.
Absolutely. We need to actively work to empower the middle percentile. That means coaxing the silent majority, those individuals who are competent, maybe even brilliant, but perhaps more risk-averse or less outspoken out of mediocrity. We need to encourage and actively reward their contributions and ideas, not just those of the loudest voices.
And the sources also talk about deliberately using unconventional thinkers.
Yes, crucially, we must also recognize and consciously utilize individuals who are inherently unconventional. This includes the mavericks, the rank bypassers, the ones who seem fearless, maybe a bit disruptive, but are willing to challenge authority constructively and try new things, even if it means risking failure.
And the introverted geniuses, too.
Yes, exactly. These are often highly skilled individuals, perhaps those brilliant intelligence analysts or engineers or cultural experts who might shun the spotlight but possess profound intellectual depth and unique perspectives. They absolutely must be utilized as essential contestability agents in planning groups and cross-disciplinary workshops.
Contestability agents, what's their role?
Their job, literally, is to question the prevailing assumptions, to poke holes in the groupthink, to identify the cognitive blind spots of the planning group. They are crucial for injecting that intellectual rigor and preventing premature convergence on a flawed solution.
I loved the real-world example provided in Creativity and Military Complexity about how one organization actually tried to institutionalize organizational courage. Can you share that?
Oh, the Joker card concept. It's a fantastic illustration of trying to normalize boundary pushing and calculated risk. Initially, apparently, it was a practical tool used by some flying squadron commanders. They'd issue these annual get-out-of-jail-free cards to their pilots.
Seriously?
Yeah, the idea was to encourage a healthy workplace culture where pilots felt empowered to try things, maybe push the limits safely, or report minor errors without fear of draconian punishment. It fostered learning.
Yeah.
But then, according to the source, a former chief of the Royal New Zealand Air Force took this concept a giant step further. He decided to award an annual Joker card to every single person in the entire Air Force, regardless of rank or role.
Wow, that's bold.
It was an incredibly audacious move, but it sent this powerful symbolic message from the very top that excessive bureaucracy, rigid adherence to minor rules, and the paralyzing fear of making small errors were actually secondary to the need for adaptability, learning, and innovative thinking across the whole organization.
That is true institutional courage right there.
It really is. And tying this back to the overall social structure within these organizations, the source argues strongly that we must shift the culture away from intense internal competition towards what they call co-opetition, meaning collaboration, even amongst potential competitors.
Why is that important?
Because the traditional hierarchical structure often drives intense competition for rank advancement, for resources, for recognition. This can seriously undermine the unity of effort and the open sharing of information that are absolutely essential for tackling complex adaptive systems effectively. The problem is simply too overwhelming, too dynamic for any single person, no matter how brilliant, to anticipate all the angles. We must leverage the collective wisdom of diverse teams and advisors to cancel out individual cognitive blind spots and ensure the design effort is truly comprehensive and robust. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. Well, this deep dive has really thoroughly mapped the arc of cognitive military planning, haven't it? It emphasizes that effective joint planning seems to hinge entirely on the commander and their staff utilizing this operational design thinking to correctly frame those wicked problems within an intensely complex adaptive environment. It really feels like the necessary bridge, linking that high-level strategy and national interests directly down to focused tactical actions.
I think that's right. And the enduring utility of design thinking, fundamentally, maybe its most important function, is as a tool to continuously challenge your own initial assumptions and what you think you know, your perceived knowledge. You have to rigorously protect against those dangerous cognitive errors like survivorship bias.
Survivorship bias.
Yeah.
Right. That's drawing conclusions only from the things that survived some process, ignoring those that didn't.
Exactly. The classic example, mentioned in Creativity and Military Complexity, is the World War II bomber anecdote. Analysts initially looked at the bombers returning from missions and saw where they were riddled with bullet holes. Their first instinct was, naturally, okay, let's reinforce those areas with more armor.
Makes sense on the surface.
But it took critical design thinking, looking at the problem differently, for someone, Abraham Wald, actually to point out the flaw. The true lesson wasn't where the returning planes were hit, it was where they weren't hit.
Ah, because planes hit in those other areas presumably didn't make it back at all.
Precisely. Those hits were likely fatal. So the areas needing reinforcement were the clean spots on the returning planes, the engines, the cockpit, because those were the vulnerable points indicated by the missing data from the planes that were lost. Survivorship bias almost led them to reinforce the strong points instead of the weak ones.
That's really sobering reminder that incomplete data or data looked at the wrong way can lead to spectacularly wrong conclusions.
Indeed. And looking ahead, the future of national security, well, it will inevitably favor those organizations that are most adaptable, most capable of rapid learning and change. The military innovation ecosystems needed for this, they're never static. They require constant investment, constant tending.
Okay.
So this raises a final, maybe provocative, but crucial question for you, the listener, as you think about your own professional journey, whatever field you're in. Given that large organizations, military or otherwise, frequently struggle with internal competition, stovepipes, and sometimes that paralyzing fear of failure we discussed, how might your organization or you within it work to institutionalize the reward of genuine professional development, intellectual curiosity, and calculated risk-taking? How do we value learning from failure rather than just rewarding competitive achievement scores or adherence to process? How do we ensure we can continually reframe the problem faster and more accurately than any adversary or competitor can adapt?